Hello, welcome again to EDFGC5810, and this is the second seminar in which is for the online students. And this week we're really going to try to reflect on the focus of your research and formulate some questions, as well as unpack some considerations as you begin to prepare some literature review for your proposal. So the focus of this seminar is for you to understand the purposes of questioning, to investigate the types of questions we use and their impact on thinking, learning and research, and to explore how examples of research questions have been explored by qualitative scholars, because that's our focus this week, in order to give you a clear understanding of the different research approaches that exist. And we're also going to identify relevant methodological considerations and critically review a sample of a qualitative publication. That's actually one of your online tasks this week. So if we think back to last week, and certainly having read through your forum posts, you've got a pretty clear idea about what research is and why we do it. You've identified a number of different reasons and examples of you having investigated something. And to a degree, you've actually also addressed the next obvious questions. How? By making that concept map of how you might investigate one of those 8 SOR questions. But the focus is very much today in trying to kind of unpack some of these approaches from a fairly abstract point of view in respect to a paradigm, which is like a school of thought and an approach. So it's a little bit abstract. Just kind of a word of warning that you might find it at times a bit challenging. So when we look at the how, we're really talking about methodology, and we're going to cover that in more detail in the subsequent sessions, but broadly speaking, they're kind of 3 approaches. And sometimes, or quite often actually, we use terms that overlap with the same concept. But essentially you've got qualitative, which is what we're focusing on today, and that's inductive, an inductive approach, and I'm going to unpack that more shortly. We also have quantitative or a deductive approach, and in fact looking at your concept maps, and also quite a few of you have kind of got a science background, so that seems to be quite a prominent approach. And often when we think about research, we think about measuring things and testing whether or not something is correct, which is a deductive approach, although actually not that common really in education. And also a third way, or pragmatic approach, is a mixed methods approach, where you use a bit of qualitative and quantitative approaches for different purposes or different elements of a research question. So broadly speaking, in order to determine one's research approach, we need to actually consider the relationship between theory and research, because theory plays quite a big role. And this is, I know, quite abstract, but nevertheless really important, and we're going to kind of revisit this a number of times. In a deductive approach, theory, everything kind of starts with theory. It guides the research. Whereas if we're looking at an inductive approach, theory kind of comes out of that, and I'm going to go for it more. So even though you're reading at the beginning, even if you're using an inductive approach, you're not actually so theory driven. It's a lot more open to begin with. Now, I like to use examples from cooking. As you can see, I like to eat, but I also think it's quite helpful in just making examples kind of from everyday life. And I don't know if you've had a look at Shane Delia's various cooking programs on SBS, but I think he actually gives us quite a nice little example. So if we're looking at an inductive approach, excuse me, it's an open approach in which new ways of looking at a thing are welcomed, and that's where Shane comes in, because if you've seen his little food journey or spice journey, he goes to all these different countries. He then learns about sort of family recipes and ingredients and the methods that they use. It's really quite site specific, and then he puts his own stint on that. He takes his it's quite subjective in that he interprets that, and he says, okay, well, this is how I'm going to come up with a new recipe that's influenced by these ideas. And then he cooks up something and puts it in his restaurant. So it's a situational and situationally specific approach, if you like, which makes for really rich understandings. And subjectivity is kind of, you own it in that. It's not something you shy away from. The individuals in that approach are really crucial in respect to forming an understanding. And from that, we get new insights and new theories. That's an inductive approach. On the other hand, and I'm going to continue unpacking this, on the other hand, we've got a deductive approach, which is framed by theory, and it sets out to test a clearly defined variable. Now you've got, I don't know if you, I'm not much of a cook, but as I said, I think it's quite a helpful example. If you've ever seen the slow cooked eggs, you cook them at a certain, you probably have an egg that's a certain size, you cook them at a certain temperature for a certain period of time. So you're kind of controlling the environment and you're seeking to be as objective as possible. And the aim is there to generate findings that can be generalized to the wider population. So you're not seeking to be subjective there at all. You're seeking to test something and you're measuring something probably. And a lot of the time that's when we use the quantitative, in that we might tallying something, we might look at the effect size between pre-test and post-test. And a lot of the examples that you suggested when you started thinking of your concept map in respect to that question tended to kind of be in that paradigm. So I'm hoping to broaden your horizons and get you to consider some inductive approaches as well. So which one should you use? Well, that depends on whatever it is you're looking at and your question that you wish to investigate. Again, just a quick revisit before we look more at questions. And in a deductive approach, you use the theory to begin with. And that's where the literature review is really essential, because that's where you find exactly what has been done and what kind of variables have been tested. You then form a hypothesis, and as you probably know, a hypothesis is actually a statement that is either in the positive or negative, whether it's a null or an alternative hypothesis. It's not actually a question. It's one thing that you're testing to whether or not it is happening. Then you collect the data, you get the findings by having analysed the data, often in a statistical manner, so using SPSS, for example, to calculate whether or not something stacks up and whether it's statistically significant. And then based on that, you either reject or confirm your hypothesis, i.e. that statement you had, and then based on that, you might revise theory and kind of contribute to knowledge that way. So it's a scientific approach, generally, that you're probably fairly familiar with. The alternative is an inductive approach where you obviously, I mean, it's not like you're just wandering about. You will have something that you're looking at and you will have selected a setting, just like Shane and his cooking adventures. He's deliberately gone to a particular country to explore a certain cuisine, but he's using observations that become findings that are analysed using themes or emerging themes. And you're quite willing to be guided and explore new things because you know roughly what you're looking for, but you're certainly willing to experience and find new avenues of insight in an inductive approach. And from there, you generate theory that's obviously specific to a particular setting, but nevertheless, they're really important. And if you're looking at yourself as a practitioner, the theory that you're coming up on will not apply to all other pre-service teachers, but it will be really quite significant to your own practice, which is why we're kind of covering that. So why do we post questions? Well, we post questions to find out prior knowledge in our teaching. You know, what do you know about this concept? We use it as an assessment tool often to check understandings and reveal gaps and recognise confusion. And we use it to foster, to kind of prompt our students to, and fellow people, to think creatively and reflectively, to promote justifications and use evidence. So what makes you say that? What kind of evidence can you put forward to support that idea? And we use questions to promote dialogue and substantive conversation, build curiosity, and also build the capacity to listen, and so on. When we look at research questions, we can kind of categorize them into a number of different sorts of questions, and this is leading into one of your tasks for this week. Some questions are quite descriptive. We find out information about something, whether it's qualitative or quantitative data that is required to answer that question. We're still kind of using a descriptive approach. We might provide themes and categories as part of our description of this thing that we're seeking to answer. Another alternative is analytic questions, which extend description, so they're deeper. They kind of start, just like if you're thinking of Bloom's taxonomy, where we've got fairly descriptive basis and then going into the higher echelons, which are more analytical. Well, in an analytical question, we're seeking to extend that description and describe it possibly as a hypothesis, and we look for a causal relationship a lot of the time. So that implies that a lot of the time we're actually looking at a quantitative approach where we're measuring the size of an effect or a correlation between variables. Evaluative questions explore how well or how badly something is being achieved, and they require a really careful definition. In a predictive question, we seek to predict an impact influence. Generally use quantitative methods in those types of questions. So to what degree do time spent with laptops influence post-test results in a kind of revision format for university students or something like that? That was just plucked out of the air, as you probably could tell, but as an example. Problem-solving questions explore ways to improve and are often used very commonly in practitioner research because it's a connection to, again, an authentic context, something that you feel it might be that you want to be better at using a particular teaching strategy because you feel a need for that. So it's a problem, might be something you thought, oh, why did that happen? So it becomes a problem-solving approach. Theory-building questions explore new ways of seeing things and are often quite abstract, perhaps not necessarily as closely connected to real world, if you like. And from a practitioner point of view, you could do it, but you're probably more likely to use one of those other approaches. So your first forum task for this week is to actually mix and match. Given what I just told you about these different types of questions, and certainly I would encourage you to have a look in your Wilson book as well, have a look at the question and try to actually categorize it as well. So you've got the questions there, you can read them in your own time. I'm going to pause this, or you might want to pause the recording as you spend time on that task. Your next task is for you to consider what sort of research questions or question are you toying with. And I actually want you to formulate what you think you're going to look at as part of your teacher's researcher A. I always forget what this particular subject is called, but as part of this course. So post your research question, and I know that this is probably, it's in working progress. I'm not expecting to see it phrased exactly that way when you develop your proposal, but it is a process and you should be actually starting to get down to what you think you're going to look at. And I want you to categorize it in respect to whether it's descriptive, analytic, evaluative, predictive, problem solving, or a theory building question, and explain, and this is important, explain why you call it that. So connect back to what those aspects are. Think about how you're phrasing your question and how it fits in with that approach to questioning. So that's your second task. Some things to consider. A research question summarizes the significant issue that your research will investigate. And the title, when you then develop your proposal, consists of the topic and the outcome of a research project often. The research problem that you will articulate as part of your introduction to your proposal, for example, explains the knowledge gap that your research will address. And for you to know what that knowledge gap is, you will have needed to engage a bit with the literature. And your research focus specifies the scope or the domain of the inquiry. So your third task, and again, this is a working document. I've given you two, I'm just going to move this because I keep kicking a rubbish bin. I know that you might just have one question. If you got two that you're toying with, you got space to do it there. I want you to actually complete this table. So summarize the significant issue that your research will investigate and articulate your research question, which you would have done anyway as part of question 2, task 2. What sort of problem does this address? What is the knowledge gap that your research will address? Now, I know that you won't know the gap in existing understandings yet because you haven't investigated the literature, but try to pinpoint it, try to identify it, or at least think about it. What's going to be your research focus? What kind of domain of inquiry or scope in respect to how broad you're going to go? And what's your possible title? Again, a working document, but it's there to prompt your thinking. And I will also actually put up some examples of research proposals that that were developed by students that I taught previously, and they're happy for me to share them. So it's just an example. You might look at how it possibly may look, and some of these terms you will find in those proposals as well as they articulate their scope. You've also got a video to watch, and this is in your own time. You don't actually need to post this on the forum, but it's there anyway. If you're still struggling to come up with a question, have a look at that video. I will put up the link, separately and identify, excuse me, 2 questions that you've seen that you might possibly investigate in some way. Okay. Shifting the focus slightly. Excuse me. So, we've thought about your research question, and I've kind of hinted that you really need to make a connection to literature, but as a warm-up to that, I want you to consider what different types of scholarly papers and what types of sources of literature that you could actually use to investigate your question have you come across. And I want you to list as many as you can think of, so certainly not just 2 types of papers, but as many as you can. And this is your next forum task, and we're actually up to forum task 4 for this one. So list them and then explain why they're written. What's the purpose of that type of text? I will ask you to pause this recording as you jot down your thoughts. It's again just to get you to think about the different sources of information that you might be connecting to. And on the next slide, I'm going to give you some examples. So just rack your brain first, jot it out, and then have a look. Pausing now. So some examples that you've probably come across: textbooks about, might be a particular thing like child development or literacy types of textbooks, and they provide content knowledge. That's the purpose of them, and they may be aimed at a general audience or quite a specialist audience, so they're quite useful to refer to. However, be mindful that a lot of the time it becomes kind of a combination or a collection of what other people have thought. So often they actually refer to all these other scholars. So if you find that you're reading, for example, a book on child development, and it's referring to Vygotsky in respect to thought and language, for example, then go to that source. But it's a good kind of lead-in a lot of the time when we're looking at finding information. Sometimes, and these are mainly journal articles, a lot of the time we find theoretical discussions which are focused on a theoretical concept, and the author is probably trying to reconceptualize an existing, shouldn't be an existing theory. Quite often these are fairly abstract and aimed at a specialist audience, possibly not particularly useful for your purposes. So as you start looking at your literature, maybe just leave that one for a while. Literature reviews are fairly common forms of journal articles that you find, and it has an explicit focus on the key ideas and arguments which have been published about a certain topic within often a very clearly specified period of time. So they're looking at, can be a meta-analysis as well, where they look at all these different studies that have been conducted that generate findings. And the author or authors, if they're more than one, need to clearly account for the limitations and the search parameters which have been applied as they search for the literature, and they compare and contrast how different scholars have positioned themselves. It's really quite a useful form of information for this course, but again, use it as kind of a hint of what to read rather than go in that so-and-so has cited in, because if you fall into that cited in trap, you're actually relying on someone else's interpretation of what the original argued, and that's not a particularly good position to be in. You're much better off using it as an indication, thinking, okay, yeah, this gives you an overview and you can cite that person who's done the literature review. But then if they seem to be aspects or particular references that they refer to that you think, oh yeah, that sounds great, then go to that source as you read literature to inform you in respect to your research question. Studies are another quite a common form of paper. Generally, they follow the format of an introduction and a background that contextualizes the study and explains the aims. Then a literature review follows, where the different ideas, theories, and previous findings that inform that author's understanding of the study are accounted for. Then they explain the methodology, exactly what they did to investigate their issue, to answer the research question. Sometimes there's a specific section in the paper which is the results of findings, where they explain what they found and then they discuss it. At other times, the discussion of the findings is actually, or the findings is integrated into the discussion. The discussion is important because that's where the interpretation comes in. So it's not just, this is what I found, it's what does it mean? And in that discussion, a good discussion really effectively contextualizes the findings of the present study to what previous literature has said. And that's important. So you should actually find quite a lot of the references that were cited in the literature review section, they should also appear in the discussion, where the researcher talks about what their findings were and how that relates, the so what, if you like, how that relates to the ideas that already existed. There's also a limitation section often, where they explain the limits of the conclusions drawn and often flag future research as well. They also explain how generalizable they are and to what degree they're met. Now, studies are really useful for this course because such papers give you an idea of both theory, content, and approach. So you're going to be drawing on that. So to hold your hand, if you like, I've uploaded 3 qualitative articles, and I want you to read one of them. So pick any of them. The first one is an action research project that was investigated by Peter Gresham and I can't remember what the second person's first name is. Gresham's the main author though, the other one's the librarian. Looking at competition games and technology, boys are loving English. So it was conducted at a single-sex school in Sydney, which is important to know. So when you're looking at, for example, who was included as a participant, don't think that, oh, they didn't include any girls. Well, that's because there weren't any girls. It's a boys' school. The second paper is actually an old student paper from CSU, So it's not a published or formally published work, but I think it could be quite helpful anyway to have a look at what a report eventually might look like. And the purpose of that was an action research study that was aimed at determining students' perspectives on interactive whiteboards in relation to their learning. The third one is a paper by Maxwell looking at Year 5 children's drawings and their primary school experiences, which is again is kind of an emerging or an interpretive, inductive approach. So pick either of those. I don't really care which one. It's up to you. And what I want you to do, and this is your fifth task, sorry, it should say 5 up there. Your fifth task is to critique and interpret the key ideas and findings. And this is just there to scaffold you as you start investigating more papers for your own purposes. The questions I want you to answer in your forum post are: what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the literature review in that paper you're looking at? Did they read widely? Is there evidence of that? Is it current? Now, obviously, you need to look at when the paper was published in order to determine whether it was current. So are a lot of the references they cite within 5 years of their publication? Is there evidence of international perspectives? Is the sample population described adequately? Is there anything else you'd like to know about it? And if so, why? Again, all these connect back to the research question, because it all comes back to how the research question, rather, what they're talking about in their paper, how it addresses the research question. The methods that they use to collect data, would you say that they're effective? Are there strengths and weaknesses in respect to how those methods helped the persons writing the paper address the research questions? And what are the strengths and weaknesses in the researcher's discussion of the findings? Are there links back to references of other scholars' knowledge in the discussion? How generalizable are the findings, and what kind of factors might influence generalizability? And with that, do keep in mind that these are qualitative papers, first and foremost, which means that they are site-specific, and they're not actually, the aim is there to seek a rich and complex understanding which is site-specific. So just keep that in mind. And also, how might you modify or extend this research in order to learn more? So that's your fifth task. Now, we've got one more thing that I want you to do. And as you start to find articles and books and so on, and particularly, it's a good idea for you to find some studies, start getting into the habit of annotating the literature you come across. And the reason why is because it makes it a lot easier when you start developing your literature review, and we're going to start working on that next week. So start, and I will put this table up so you can use that and just copy and paste it accordingly. Start by putting the author and the year. Now, always, you probably know this, but just in case you don't, always make sure you write the authors in the order that they're cited in the paper, because it reflects the lead author, the person who did the most work, and then secondary authors. So it's really important that you get that right. And a lot of the time people work in teams, so the same authors may have several publications for the same year, but you will be able to identify the different ones because they're in a different order depending on who was the lead author for the paper you cite. The aim of the study, often the abstract gives a really nice little concise description of that. Again, a lot of these questions are actually in the abstract, you will find them. The sample, so who participated in the study, not just the number of them, but were there particular people. Like, for example, in that Maxwell one, we're looking at Year 5 children's drawings, and there's 72 pupils. So you would put that in there. Site and country, so where was it conducted? It might have been at a particular university, or it might have been in a primary school setting, and if it was a country that's named, then good idea to include that. What sort of methodology? So the how did they investigate or address the research question? put in some dot points there. And what are some of the findings? The key findings they found, what kind of conclusions did they draw? And this is the important bit. What's your interpretation of that? Particularly in respect to your research question. So are there things in here that are particularly poignant, and you also use the space to articulate relevance to your research question or topics? There might be used a really good method of data collection that I might use in my own research, or found that, I don't know, boys persist longer on task if there's an element of competition, which is relevant. It might be relevant to your own research question, which is relevant to my study because, or whatever. So it's just kind of a note for your own thinking. But later on, as you start to actually synthesize some of the literature in your literature review, these tables are really helpful. So get into the habit. So it should be 6th task is to locate at least 3 studies. So rather than look at literature reviews or textbooks in general, try to actually find some studies that relate to your research question, and complete the table below, one for each of the studies you cite, and upload it onto this week's forum. And that's it. That's your tasks for this week, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with. Thank you.